This month, the nation marked the 1921 Tulsa Massacre, but black communities were attacked like this across the country. 11 years before Tulsa, white mobs terrorized the black community in Slocum, Texas, 130 miles southeast of Dallas. They hunted the Negroes down like sheep, Sheriff W. H. Black of nearby Palestine said at the time. 8 victims are listed on a historical marker there. But writer E.R. Bills, who wrote 2 books about the attack and helped fight for the marker, says the actual casualties could rival Tulsa's.
What happened in Slocum, it was late July 1910. I think it was July 29th exactly. And on that day, the white citizens in the southeastern part of Anderson County up in East Texas, northeast Texas, they started killing African Americans on sight. You know, there were a lot of reasons. They say, it occurred, why it started. But basically, at the end of the day, what they did was cut phone lines in the areas where African Americans lived, and they just went through slaughtering them wholesale.
And this is over 2 days or over one night?
Started on the 29th, and it really continued until August 1st when the Texas Rangers showed up. A few people were killed the first night, I think the 29th. Although it's really unclear. Several more were killed the next day. Dozens, they say, mobs up to 300, 400 white men marching through areas unopposed, killing every African American they saw on sight. The official reports at the time indicated there were only 7 or 8. Well, some of them said 22 or 18, but at the end of the day, after the initial investigation, they had 7 or 8 bodies. And the newspapers reported between 7 and 22 casualties. So you have white mobs of hundreds, dozens, roaming through the area, killing black folks on sight. Well, they ran for their lives, the ones that could escape. They left properties, they left, homes. And they didn't return. A lot of them changed their names or changed the spelling of their names, like the Hollies. But they didn't come back, and they weren't able to, take care of their dead, give them proper funerary rites. In some cases, if they found them dead, they buried them themselves so they wouldn't be desecrated. But then they fled. In other cases, as I said, they just flat fled. So what it amounted to was a racial expulsion, which stemmed from, an act of genocide, a massacre.
District Judge Benjamin Gardner indicted 7 and transferred the case to Harris County. Bills said it's one of the earliest instances of whites being charged for the deaths of blacks. The case languished in the courts. Defendants won bail, and nobody was convicted. Less than 3 years after the slaughter, a fire destroyed the local courthouse and the records from the case. Bills said Slocum descendant Constant Holly Jewade knows the location of many more graves.
They went and they buried at least 6 bodies there was the initial count, but some of the newspaper reports and the journalists at the time said, well, those were the people they knew the names of, but they were bringing other bodies out of the local forest and brush and everything else, and they were dumping those in the pit, this unmarked pit as well. So they're not sure, it's not clear how many bodies were in that particular spot, but that is the location of that Constance and I have. Well, that is the unmarked mass grave that we've located. Mm-hmm. And when Constance approached the owner of that property, he was really upset, and he said, there's not 7 or 8, there's 55. There's up to 55 bodies here, but they're on my land and they're my property, and there's nothing you can do about it. So it's a whole other story unto itself. I mean, we know who owns the land. He's admitted, the fact there's a mass grave there and there's nothing we can do about it. So, but anyway, so there's at least 2 or 3 mass graves discussed, and again, they think the oral tradition, suggests that there are up to 200 bodies there. Again, it dwarfs the Rosewood Massacre in Florida, which the descendants of have received reparations. Actually, this bill was signed by Jeb Bush, but they've had a state investigation, all that. And again, in Oklahoma, they've done the same thing. But here in Texas, where up to 200 African Americans are still buried in unmarked mass graves, we can't get an official state investigation. But But 200 is the number. I think it's a pretty solid number. Could exceed that, could be a little less, but I think it's close to that. We also have testimony from descendants of actual perpetrators of the massacre. One came forward several years back in 2013. He's since passed. His name was Warren Patinos, but he came forward and said his great-granduncle or whatever, I don't remember the iteration, the grand-granduncle, it's in the book though, he had fled to Georgia after the Rangers showed up. When people got wind that the law was coming that way, folks went around covering their tracks, burying bodies, dumping them in these pits to get rid of, evidence for what had occurred. So by the time the Rangers showed up, again, there were only 7 or 8 identifiable bodies and supposedly, not that much more to work with. But this guy, Warren Patinos, he said his granduncle, had fled and, to avoid prosecution and that they had basically covered their tracks, which makes sense. So it's unclear, but the evidence and just common sense clearly suggests the number far exceeded 7 or 8 victims.
In 2011, the Texas House of Representatives passed a resolution recognizing the pogrom as a horrific incident deserving of attention and discussion. Only by shining a light on previous injustices, it said, can we learn from them and move forward toward a future of greater healing and reconciliation. E.R. Bills counts himself a proud Texan and says much more needs to be done.
There in Tulsa, they're trying to find mass graves. Well, Constance Holly-Joy, the chief spokesman for the descendants of the Slocum Massacre, we already know where one of the mass graves is for the Slocum Massacre. We just can't get permission to run the ground penetrating radar over it. No one will let us excavate it. Of course, the state of Texas is mute in terms of an official investigation. It's dark history, but it's our history, and I think the best way to approach it is deal with it. Acknowledge it, not just acknowledge it, but bring the full force of the law and then the textbooks. The historical arm of our state government and our educational institutions to bear on this pogrom, on this bloodshed, and then we can kind of put it behind us, maybe address some of the injustice. But until then, I think it's a farce.
The historical marker is in Anderson County, on the west side of FM 2022. E.R. Bill's book, The 1910 Slocum Massacre, An Act of Genocide in East Texas, is available on Amazon.